think you did well.
Like the language.
Kind of whitish. Then you mix the mushroom, onions, everything.
Hello and welcome back to the Way to Native Chronicles. This video is entitled, We Need to Talk. So what do we need to talk about? We need to talk about First Nations hunting rights. And I'm a little reluctant to get into this video because it's a contentious subject. And being a hunter and involved in the hunting community, in touch with hunters and shooters all the time, I know that there's a lot of strong opinions on this subject, and I'm reluctant to step into it, but you know, this channel is, after all, named The Way to Native Chronicles, and the reason that it has that name is due to a connection with Native culture, and I should actually explain that a little bit, because my wife is First Nations. We've been married for 44 years now, so we met back in 1975 in March, and we got married 5 months after that, and it's just been a great marriage ever since. But she was full status treaty. In fact, that was one of the things that interested me the most about her when I first met her. And you know, in my family, there's always been a respect for natives. Not that it was a big subject, but my father was a hunter, and I always got a sense that he admired the skills and the knowledge of native people that he met when he was hunting, and he would relate those stories back to us when we were kids. So we've always had a good respect for our indigenous peoples in Canada. Now, when it comes to the matter of status for hunting rights, that's where we start to get into a touchy area. It's a sensitive topic, especially as the populations of wildlife seem to decline with the increasing destruction of habitat and increasing population and numbers of hunters, and the quotas get lowered, and people have to go on draws. They have to wait for years and years to get a moose stag. I really sympathize with that plight, and the frustration will come out in many ways, and often it comes out against Native people, because they look around and they see, well, these Native people get to hunt all year round and pretty well for anything they want to hunt, and that's where the well, let's call it what it is, resentment comes in. And the charges of, well, this is just another form of racism, reverse racism. And we can go down that road talking about rights and wrongs in those areas. And really, I think at the end of the day, it's a lot of these positions, you can't argue somebody out of a position that they didn't reason themselves into in the first place. We usually start off with a predisposition towards a certain belief, and then look for confirmation bias, and it's really hard to get out of one camp or the other. So I don't want to go down that route of visiting and revisiting the same old tired arguments about why Native people should hunt, and why that's fair or why that's not fair. You know, we can go endlessly on that, but what I would like to do is I would like to cover some bit of history and some rationale for the situation the way it is right now, and hopefully, even if you don't agree with me on this video, maybe you come away from it with a slightly better understanding or a deeper understanding of the situation, because there are two sides to these issues. And it's not as if Native peoples have it all that well off. I know some people think they do, but you know, I've been involved in the Native community for many decades, and I can tell you they're not living up to the standard that the rest of us are. The other thing I want to mention too is that this subject can get dragged down by association with other kinds of liberal policies. I'm from Alberta. We're not too crazy about that word liberal, as you may have discovered from the recent election results. But I'm not talking about liberal in that sense exactly, but the association with all these different rights groups and grievances and identity politics, a lot of that stuff that's rife on the campuses and in the media. We get a very skewed view, and we get activists talking about the rights of this or that group, and really a lot of times these people don't even speak for their group. They're just activists. And when you talk to the ordinary rank and file of so-called members of that group, they're not as extreme as you see on TV. So this type of coverage tends to inflame the whole issue too. So don't get me wrong then, I'm not going into this from that kind of a social justice warrior angle. I just want to try to share a little bit of my understanding on the subject. And one of the key points of that, I think, as a foundation that we can start off from, something that we can all agree on, is economics. Because here we are living in actually quite a wealthy society, and we should be thankful. There's a lot of talk nowadays about being aggrieved and put down and unequal, and people complaining about a lot of things, but really we've never lived in a better time in human history than we are right now. And we would do ourselves well to take stock of how well we have it, and what is that basis that wellness is being built on. Okay, so the basis for that wellness, or that richness, prosperity that we have, the good hospitals we have, the good transportation we have, the standard of living we enjoy, the jobs we have, all these, the peace that we enjoy. All these things don't just come out of nowhere. You can look around the world and they don't exist everywhere. But one thing that we have to start off with is that economies are always built on a land base. And that's really a fundamental ingredient to a country's economy. The resources on that land base are harvested, and they're extracted and grown from that land. So you start off with your land base, and then you harvest and extract and grow goods off that land, and that activity creates jobs. It creates commodities, and it creates revenues. So when you have that activity of creating jobs, commodities, and revenues, that results in a workforce that contributes to a tax base, and that tax base is what makes it possible to build all these things that we need, like roads and hospitals, court buildings, police forces, government buildings. The list goes on and on of all that infrastructure that we acquire, because it wasn't all that long ago that Alberta was pretty well starting right from the ground up in terms of those things. So it really all starts from the land. Now the question next comes is, where did that land base come from? People maybe don't think about that all that often. It didn't just come out of nowhere. There were people living in this country before Westerners got here. And coming from a British Commonwealth system, we didn't just come in and slaughter people. I mean, there are some countries around the world that would probably go that route, I think. You know, might is right, but that was not really the way it was done here. What our country did, the British, is they signed treaties with the various Aboriginal groups in this country. When settlers were moving into the land, unlike the United States, where they just moved in first and then the law came in later. Canada was more of a paradigm where the law came in because settlers were soon to follow. So we had to make arrangements with the native peoples to see how is this going to work. You know, we don't want to have warfare. Canadians are quite peaceful people, and we're a system of laws. So the Queen authorized her representatives to speak to these peoples and see if we can come to terms with how are we going to deal with this influx of settlers into this new land that we have that we all very well knew was rich with potential. So it's something that they wanted very bad, but yet, on the other hand, the people who lived here had their way of life, and they want that very bad too. They have a responsibility to their offspring and their future generations. So they have their representatives. We have our representatives. So these treaties, when they were made so that there are benefits to be had by both sides, that the concerns that both sides had would be addressed. Now, on the Aboriginal side, the concerns were what's going to happen to our children and to us as these people move in. So they wanted assurances that their way of life would be protected. And their way of life greatly depended on the fact that they could harvest from the land in their traditional way. So the treaties were signed in such a way that would guarantee them, look, don't worry about that. You will always have that right to continue your way of life. Now, people may say, oh, they don't need to do that anymore, but that is really their decision, what if they want to continue doing that. And having dealt with Native peoples for many years now, unlike some people think, they are extremely tied to that way of life of hunting and living off the land. It's not an exaggeration. Whenever I sit down with my wife's family, that's all they talk about is hunting, and that's the thing that makes everybody's eyes light up. They really have a deep connection to the land and a spiritual connection to it. So it gives, it's really deep and embedded in their culture. You just can't take that and rip it out and throw it away and say, well, we didn't need that. It's essential. So we have these treaties. They were signed to provide hunting rights and, of course, a few other things, education and healthcare, things like that. So after we signed these treaties, the settlers came in. They, looking at what I started off with about the land being the basis for the economy, they went and they worked that land. They improved it. They took resources out of it, and jobs were created. A tax base was created. Infrastructure was created. And I don't want to get into all this stuff about mistreatment and stuff too much, because we can go on and on about that. But I know there's points in history where the Native peoples had to have a signed piece of paper just to leave their reserve. They were told, let's get into agriculture, but they weren't allowed to sell their agricultural goods outside the reserve, because that would compete with the non-Aboriginal farmers. So there's a lot of ways in which the Native peoples were set up to fail, and that they failed, it should not be a great surprise. And I'm not even getting into the disruption to their social and cultural and family life that residential schools caused. So we can move on, hopefully, to the next subject. What's another basis for economic and societal success? Well, I think what you have to look at is take a look around the world and see which systems work best. Because there's a lot of very successful, prosperous countries in the world, and there's ones that are far less successful. And I think an unbiased observer can deduce that the countries that appear to have been most successful and, let's say, the best in terms of human rights, there's exceptions and through history, of course. None of them were perfect, but in the large, the ones that were successful economically and in terms of rights and progress were the ones that actually were based on the British system. And the British system is a system that is based on the rule of law, not influenced by politics. So you have your set of laws, you have your judiciary to enforce those laws, you have your politics as well, but that politics and the judiciary have to remain separate. And any time that the politics try to step into the judicial area, as we saw recently with the last Attorney General Canada had. It's going to be fireworks, and it better be fireworks, because those two branches of government have to be distinct from each other. They have to, one does not rule the other. And the reason that this is important, and why the British system works so well, and the American system too, because they didn't just start from nothing. They took a look around the world and saw what was working and what wasn't working. So their system is very much also influenced by this. What is very important is that contracts and promises have to be maintained by law, and bribery and things like that, and radical changes, inconsistency, unpredictability in the economy has to be kept to a minimum, because when people want to invest in a country or in an industry, you get your best people, the entrepreneurs who go out and get things and build things. They have to have some confidence that the rules aren't going to change underneath their feet. And when businessmen and people and individuals all deal with each other, they make contracts of various kinds, and they have to depend on the fact that those contracts will be enforced by law. So we really need to have that system of laws and an impartial judiciary to enforce them. That's how you make a country successful. And the countries that don't have that stability and don't have that predictability and that rule of law and that separation from politics are the countries that don't do well. In fact, the people who do well in those countries, they will take their money and they will invest it in countries like ours, where they know they're going to be treated fairly. If they have a dispute in a contract, they can take it to court, and a judge who is not there to follow some politician's dictates, a judge will just look at the law and say, okay, this is either meets the law or it doesn't meet the law. So, as the contractors can do themselves too, so they have an assurance that their risk is minimized. It's very important for our prosperity. So we have to think about the next step in this. Is it possible then, in such a system where you have the British system with laws protecting people's rights and contracts, is it possible to have a situation where we just decide one day, okay, those treaties, and this is what a lot of people say, those treaties were made a long time ago, and things have changed, you know, we don't think that treaty should be observed anymore. Is that even possible? It's wishful thinking, in my opinion. You can't just take a treaty that was signed by a government and just throw it out the window. Politicians may kind of say, yeah, let's do that in order to get elected, but like I was saying before, we have that separation between the judiciary and politics. Politicians may say that, but when the person who is aggrieved by that, let's say the Native people, treaty obligations are just wiped out, they can go to court, and they can go all the way up to the Supreme Court and say, look, this is against the law what they're doing here. And the Supreme Court is going to make a judgment on that, regardless of what the politicians say. So we have we're really kind of locked into this thing, and a lot of the discussion about let's change these laws, it's time for a change, or things like that, it's really beside the point. It's unproductive. Maybe it's a way for people to vent their spleen and over their frustration over things that are related to it, but we just have to get real and just not shout into the wind. That's not the way things are going to work. In order for it to work differently, we would have to basically set aside our British system. And when we set aside our British system, we set aside that you break one law, then you break all laws. The judiciary can't just stop enforcing contracts or treaties in one case without imperiling the implementation of those things in other cases. So it's really got to be consistent. That's what makes our country so great. We stick by our word and our promises. So let's move on then from that to one of the other objections. I'm not going to make this very much longer because, I mean, I could go on and on about this, but I'm not going to drag this out too much. I just want to cover some points that I think that most people can agree on. And one of the remaining points that I think people find themselves quite justified in making is, and I hear this a lot on hunting discussion groups, is people declare that this business of natives being allowed to hunt and have these special privileges, that's actually racism. It's kind of it's a sort of a clever trick, you know, just take that racist charge and throw it right back. But, you know, that's kind of misguided, and it's deceiving, because the treaties weren't made with races. The treaties were made, it's better to think of it being made with nations. Now, it just so happens in history that all the people in these tribes and Aboriginal bands happened to be native, the Indians, so to speak, in the old term, and they were of one race. Maybe amongst themselves they thought there was also different races, but, you know, for practical purposes they were all one race. And it's not that the government said we are making a treaty with people of this race. They just made a treaty with nations and with their descendants. So of course their descendants are going to be of a certain race. Now you get into complexities of dilution and where to cut that off, and those are realistic discussions to have. And we have designated certain cutoff levels that, you know, if a status person marries a non-status after second or third generation, then finally, okay, now you're not status anymore. But that's just sort of beside the point. Those are details. Of course, you have to make these calls, but for the most part, it's just look at it as treaties made between nations. For instance, it's got nothing to do with favoring one race. It just so happens to be that way. I could maybe use an example of, let's say Canada really wanted to expand itself, and there's a nation out in the Pacific Ocean, an island there, and it's you know, we really want to have that island. Maybe we need it for some special reason. We really want it. So depending on how badly you want it, you're going to cut a deal. And so you send your emissaries over to that island, and that island has its representatives, and you meet, and you have your little discussions about, well, is this feasible? You know, would you agree to become a part of Canada and lose your sovereignty, basically, or share the land with us? You know, we want to be able to come in and build airports or whatever it is we want to do. And the people's representatives on that island would say, well, yeah, that's going to really shake the boat over here. I mean, we're a little bit worried about what's going to happen to us when an overpowering number of you people come in here with all your greater wealth and technology. I mean, we're going to be squashed here. So we want some reassurances that we're going to be protected, not just us, our children as well. So you hammer out a deal. You try to address their fears and their needs, and then in return you get the things that you want. Just so happens that all those people on that island maybe are the same race, and so you can't just take that and say, let's say 100 years later, when this treaty is still in effect, because remember, in the case of ours were written as long as the sun shines and the river flows. That's probably how they would do it for that case as well. You know, saying many years later, well, that's just racist, that's totally off the mark, and it's not really true. It's just a side effect or incidental to the whole matter. So I'd like to leave that with you. There's a few points. So what I kind of wanted to address was, the basis for an economy in terms of having a land base, and the basis for having a prosperous nation in terms of your legal system, your set of laws, and then also just kind of throw in the consideration about racism. There's many more things that can be talked about on this subject, but I think those are three that really we should be able to agree on. And I know there's stress on the animal populations when it comes to hunters, and we can go at loggerheads, but really I think at the end of the day we just have to work together. And Native peoples are also concerned about the populations of wildlife remaining high enough that they can be used. They don't want to see all the moose wiped out either. And it's not as if just one side has abuses and the other side is clean. I mean, both sides, you talk to native hunters, they see a lot of evidence of non-natives hunting in their territory, leaving animals, most of them to the waste. In a lot of cases, it really ticks them off, and they're just as mad about these kind of abuses and these bad actors in the system as non-natives are. So we really have common interests in a lot of things, and we can be reasonable with each other and say, maybe we have to accommodate each other to some extent, let's work together, but it can't really be done in a way that we just force it. We have to be respectful to each other and share this land. That was the original intent of the treaties, sharing it. So hopefully that didn't get too many people ticked off with me. I'm happy to read your comments, and if I've got some basic notions here incorrect historically or whatever, then let me know. But I kind of dreaded making this video and going into this subject, but this is the Way to Native Chronicles, okay? And I've seen a lot from both sides, and I really hope that we can continue to work together. I think the loudest voices that you hear are not really the ones that represent the majority. That's my firm belief. There are always a few hotheads spouting off rhetoric that really incites people on both sides, and there's a whole big middle of us that are willing to look at things a little bit more calmly and dispassionately, and have a willingness to work together, and also have a sense of justice and fairness. And it's not a bad idea to get to know the native communities around where you live. It's kind of sad that really there are so many fantastic cultural events occurring around every city. Right around the corner there's reserves, they have their powwows, things like that. Just get out there and attend some of these things. Native peoples are very happy to have non-native people attend their events and dance, and they like to share their culture with the broader world. And it's kind of sad that you see so few people. I live in the city of Edmonton, hundreds of thousands of people here, and they have an event for some other country of immigrants. There's a whole bunch of people come to these events, but there's these powwows and things going on all over the city and all over the country, and there's hardly anybody comes to them. It's not that they don't do a lot of advertising, admittedly, but still, these are people that we should have the strongest ties to and have the strongest motivation to work together with and to understand each other. I just love going to these events. It's totally different than other things I go to. You see really nice families. Every generation is represented. Old people, young people, children, the whole works. You know, there's a real sense of family and community that is often so missing, especially in our cities. So it's a refreshing thing to go to. And the artwork, well, you know, you can see I just kind of purposely put some of this out there. Even this vest, you know, my wife has made these things. They have a lot of things to share with the rest of us, and they're very happy to do so as a rule. So think about that. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope nobody unsubscribes to me after hearing my views, because I don't know everything. I may not be right on every single point, but I feel it's my duty to at least share what I think on this subject. So till next time, remember to subscribe to this channel if you can. If you're not ticked off with me, click subscribe, and there's also a bell icon on the page. You can click that, and then when you click that, and new videos that I produce will come your way as well, so you get a notification. I really depend on your support on this, and I enjoy doing working on this channel, doing these videos. It's getting a little bit easier each time now, so maybe I'll get better at this eventually. So till next time, God bless. Take care.